Hello and welcome to Orthodox Christian Television. I'm your host, Vincent Neiman, and joining me once again are the reader Timothy Fisher from Holy Father's Russian Orthodox Church in Manhattan, and the deacon Michael Halfert from the Greek Cathedral of St. Marcellus here in Astoria. So, in today's program, we want to discuss a recent documentary on ABC presented by Peter Jennings entitled The Search for Jesus. Now, as a reference point, we're going to start with this first clip, as we will be referring to them throughout the program.
The Gospels say that the night before he died, Jesus gathered his followers together and ate the traditional Passover dinner. What do you think that Last Supper was like?
I think it was a rather stressful meal, men and women, and then Jesus made this extraordinary announcement. This is my body and this is my blood.
And he also says, I'm not going to drink wine again until I drink it in the kingdom. He's still expecting it to come, maybe that night. The night of Passover would be a good night for the Messiah to show up and the kingdom of God to show up.
Today, the Last Supper is reenacted in a church ritual called the Eucharist, and Jesus' words, as they appear in the Gospels, are often interpreted as his prediction that he would die, and that his death would be a sacrifice, so that the sins of each of us would be forgiven. Scholars say this is probably not what it meant to Jesus.
The idea of the forgiveness of sins for Jews is a much, much bigger thing. Forgiveness of sins meant that God would finally release Israel from the sins which had caused all this trouble. So forgiveness of sins had to do with release from their political and theological slavery. What he is quite clearly saying at the supper is, Israel's history is reaching its all-important dramatic climax. It is focused on me and my work. Israel's history's climax will involve my suffering and death very soon.
Historians differ about what happened at the Last Supper. Some people think the whole speech about his body and blood at that meal was added by the Gospel writers.
It doesn't happen in the Gospel of John, for example. And you wonder, why on earth does this not happen in John? Did he forget it, as it were? And if it was so important, how can he leave it out?
So what does anyone have to say about that?
Well, in this short clip that we've just seen, Peter Jennings lays out the essential thesis of the entire 2-hour documentary, that the image of Christ, which the Church has come to accept, the two natures, fully God and fully man, and as a second person of the Trinity, is essentially a creation of the Church, created some 300 years after the fact, depending upon which theory you ascribe to, either by Constantine with his creation of the Church, which most Protestants believe that Constantine was somehow instrumental in creating either the Roman Catholic or the Orthodox Church, or if you accept the Roman Catholic viewpoint, that essentially the Church was created by St. Peter, whoever this historical St. Peter was. And essentially what Peter Jennings says is that that image of the Church, that image of Christ created by the Church, is not something which we can accept at face value, that we have to now try a more historical approach to go back, almost an archaeological approach to determining who Christ really was. And he sets himself essentially as a skeptic of the Church's view of Christ.
Mr. Fisher?
Well, I would agree with that, of course. Primarily, what Peter Jennings is doing is something that has been going on in the West for a good 200 years. Some German philosophers like Schleiermacher and Hegel and others started this whole trend towards trying to find what they called a historical Jesus. In other words, trying to apply the methods and the values and criteria of history and historiography to the person of Jesus Christ, and attempt to discover through this means whether there really was someone, what was he like, and what did he teach, and what did he represent. But this is inherently flawed, because they have at their disposal very limited sources. We have the 4 Gospels, which are complete texts, and among all the texts of the ancient world, these are the texts that are best preserved. There are the most number of them in the most different places.
In fact, there's more historical evidence that Christ existed than Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, or any of the great figures of ancient history. We have more, if we're going to apply the same criteria to the existence of a human being that they apply to Jesus, then you could call into question most of the great historical figures, which the West simply, has simply accepted as part of our cultural heritage.
Right. So the next question then becomes, what can one say about Jesus Christ as merely a man on the basis, excuse me, of historical criteria? And there really isn't much.
How can you do that?
Because if you're going to immediately exclude as questionable anything the Church has handed down in its tradition, and treat that with extreme skepticism, then you're really left with very little concrete evidence. There's almost no archaeological evidence. There are no original manuscripts of the Gospels, and so on and so forth, which are the usual way that you apply historical criteria to something.
So it's a very humanistic and rationalistic approach to the whole
Well, that's what
thing.
it's based on. It's based on the idea that somehow by assembling actual empirical evidence and then applying rationalistic criteria to it, is this phrased the same way in the different Gospels? Does the Gospel use the same phraseology within the Gospel? You're treating, in other words, the Gospels as you would any normal historical text, which is problematical.
That the Gospels are part of a tradition. They're part of a long-standing series of documents, series of oral teachings which the Church has preserved. And that's one of my essential problems with this, is that all of these approaches are essentially Protestant. They've rejected the entire tradition. This is Protestantism taken to its logical extreme, where the text itself, the Bible, is the only authority, the only means by which you can come to know Jesus. The entire tradition of the Church.
It's even worse than that, because it doesn't even accept that text as being genuine or as being written by the people it purports to be written by, but by an assemblage of people whom they give different letter names to, and so on and so forth.
Or inspired by the Holy Spirit.
No, that is completely ruled out, and this is the essential problem, because what you're dealing with when you're dealing with Christianity in particular is the action of God in history, inspiring people to say certain things or to write certain things, very specifically, word for word, and to a certain extent. And there is in the Orthodox teaching, it works out to being a cooperation between the person's historical context fed through him and his individuality with the divine inspiration. And if you're going to exclude the divine inspiration from the start, then you're really left with very, very little.
In fact, most biblical scholars would admit that in order for their thesis concerning the textual tradition of, and the textual criticism of Scripture is based upon a bedrock assumption that God does not intervene in history. In fact, that God cannot intervene in history.
That's right, because they have to apply the laws, as it were, of normal human recounting of an event. And if these laws can be abrogated by divine inspiration as a kind of a miracle, then their criteria become totally useless, which is our point.
And since the anti-supernatural bias, which is inherent from the beginning of this piece, you automatically have to call into question anything, any event which has any connotation of the miraculous, any connotation of the intervention of the divine into this materialistic realm.
And those are empirical experiences, if you will, which real people have had, and I'm sorry,
well, you
that
see,
is a cooperation.
That's what we believe. Unfortunately, these
earth.
people believe that these are somehow purely subjective experiences, or, as they say in this piece very often, these are invented for the sake of impressing the followers or impressing the Jewish community with continuity of Christ. In other words, they are frauds. He doesn't come out and say it in so many words, but that is the implication. Another problem I have with this whole program is that if we're going to apply these sorts of criteria to the Gospels, why don't we apply those criteria to the people he interviews, the various so-called scholars that he invokes? He does not, in any point during this whole 2-hour program, except by giving you the name of the person and maybe a book he has written or his academic affiliation, does not tell you where these people are coming from. What is their point of view? Is it legitimate? Does it too deserve some skeptical, critical approach?
In fact, he doesn't tell you at all what their personal beliefs about Christ are, or lack of beliefs about Christ.
They only seem to support his original premise.
And that's another one of the problems with this, is that from the beginning, the people he chooses to put on as representatives of believing that these were real events that the angel spoke are not people that most people would accept as authorities. He chooses people which sound ignorant.
Well, he chooses men on the street, but I'm referring to his scholars that he
But I'm saying he sets the scholars against these
yes, exactly.
men in the street.
Yeah, instead of putting up against these rather, although you could argue that some of these scholars are more traditional than others. Someone like Marcus Borg, who's involved in something called the Jesus Seminar, comes from an extremely revisionist, liberal, left-wing kind of point of view that basically reduces Jesus Christ to being what in Orthodox terms would be called an Aryan conception of Christ, that he was a mere human being who was inspired by God or lifted at some later point to some kind of divinity, if he's willing to accept even that, which I doubt. But in any case, that's one extreme. On the other extreme, you have N.T. Wright, who supposedly is a more traditional Western writer on these subjects. But in fact, he is nothing more than what they call the canon theologian of Westminster Abbey, which means he's an Anglican, which is an extremely doctrinally diffuse confession, and not very traditional at all.
I'd like to show another clip.
Yes, I was just going to say that. I think the viewers might need a further reference point here to really absorb and to put into context the things that you two have been saying. So could we see the next clip, please?
Looking for mathematical or scientific proof. In history, that doesn't exist. What we're looking for is likelihood, possibility, plausibility, stuff like that. And in history, that's as far as you get, that's as good as you get. And when it comes to the birth narratives, no, I can't say it's even probable, because it remains highly improbable that things like this happen. However, I know as a historian that history is full of things which were improbable at the time, and yet, my goodness, they happened.
Why do you think...
So, Timothy, speaking of Mr. Wright, we just saw a clip where he was speaking. What would you like to comment about that?
Well, that's a good example of his point of view. I mean, he's trying to take into consideration the usual historical criteria, but from a slightly more believing conservative point of view. Than somebody like
Well,
Marcus
he acknowledges
Borg.
the possibility that Jesus could have been born in Bethlehem, because unlikely things have happened. But he also begins that piece by saying it's improbable.
So he's using, in other words, the normal criteria of probability and the normal of normal life And in so doing, he begs the question as to whether, you know, you can rely upon revelation as expressed through the Gospels, as a means for coming to the historical Jesus. Because what do we really want when we want the historical Jesus? We want the actual Jesus. We want the facts. Well, if you're going to exclude the divine from this whole picture, you're excluding, you know, what, 75% of the facts, which is an absurdity, in a sense, and why as perhaps well-meaning as Jennings may be in doing this program, he has in fact limited himself so severely because of trying to, I assume, take into consideration what would be the normal viewer's viewpoint, that a religious point of view on Jesus would be biased, would be a matter of subjectivity. He does not realize that there is an objectivity to
Well, he doesn't realize
divinity
the entire
and
history of the church, how Christianity began as a movement among the Jews of Palestine and how it spread in the course of 300 years and became...
Well, he's aware of that.
Obviously, but he doesn't, and the thought never occurs to him, or it does occur to him and he just quickly dismisses it, that in fact people believe these stories to be true. The basis of the spreading of this good news, as the church calls it, was a belief that these books reflected historical reality, that there was a child who was born in Bethlehem named Jesus, and this child went through these experiences as outlined in the Gospels, and he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, as we as Christians recite in the Creed. He suffered, died, and was buried, and on the third day he rose again. That those events described in the Gospels had a historical reality.
Yeah.
Well, plus, speaking of history, I notice you have here a copy of Eusebius, The History of the Church. He doesn't mention a number of writings and the continuity of the teaching, which was unbroken from the time of Christ and the apostles. There was a continuity, and is today,
and there's
he
not
doesn't
only
refer to at all.
And there's not only the continuity, there's also a consensus. Now, they love to bring up all kinds of off-color, if I can call them that, sort of fringe elements at the time.
Or they talk about the diversity of Christianity. They'll say, well, there were all these Gnostic writings like the Nag Hammadi Library, or like Elaine Pagels, who's one of the people in this group that's highly critical of Orthodox Christianity.
Right, and yet the church very, very firmly, not on an authoritarian basis, but on the basis of a consensus of through the centuries and across geography, has concluded that these things are questionable at best, and certainly not reliable, whereas they put their complete trust in the four Gospels.
And part of the reason I brought the book here tonight was that Jennings' approach of trying to find the historical Jesus, going out and checking documentary sources and archaeological evidence, is not the first time that this has been done. In fact, Constantine the Great commissioned that this be done by this Eusebius, a bishop of Caesarea, and that a history be written of Christianity and of the movement. And this is the document which was produced.
And that's the early 4th century, correct?
Yes. And scholars, instead of dealing with the information in this book, dealing with the fact that he had at his disposal more documents, more documentary evidence, more archaeological evidence, he was closer to the source, rather than dealing with the material in this book, they do what is convenient for them. They simply ignore it.
Where the Orthodox Church has not, because that's part of the tradition that you're talking about. And tradition not just in the sense of, oh, something that was created like the American tradition, as you were, surrounding Christmas.
And I would say, you know, tradition has gotten a bad name. I would say the living witness, the continuous living witness of the church. That, you know, people think, well, you know, how did this book, and later in the program he talks about how, you know, all we really have is the Bible to base our information on Christ, and that's not necessarily true. At the time that this book was written, there were an abundant number of sources many of which were destroyed, unfortunately, over the course of history, an abundant number of sources of Jesus. In fact, he describes various other writings, including the writing of one Papias of Hierapolis, called An Oration of the Oracles of the Lord, in 5 books, of which only fragments now survive, quoted in other writers, in which the full life of Christ and all of Christ's sayings were laid down. Unfortunately, many of these writings and much of this information has been lost in the course of history. But that's why I said it. And the standard answer. I mean, if you go to a biblical scholar today and ask them about this book, they'll say what they always say. Well, the church produced this book, the church preserved this book, and the church cannot ultimately be trusted.
Which, of course, is a contradiction in terms, as far as we're concerned. Simply because one of the primary criteria for being a Christian is truthfulness, is honesty about oneself and one's faults, about one's times and these other things. And if you can't trust the saints, who are paragons of truth and humility, who are you going to trust? A group of scholars who basically are largely engaged in probabilities and guesswork on the basis of humanistic and rationalistic criteria? Or are you going to deal with saints who, and this is very rarely brought in as a possible line of argument against this kind of purely scholarly approach to religion, or in general Christianity in particular, and that is, there have been many, many encounters between the saints and the earlier saints in visions and in manifestations, or Christ and the apostles, and these are not examples of hysterical self-delusions. They are legitimate, concrete experiences, which you can't describe necessarily the means by which they happen. They don't happen necessarily solely in the material plane. However, these encounters would be very, 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 what shall I say, difficult to reconcile with a point of view that takes the Gospels skeptically.
Also, too, I mean, even if you're not going to accept these, as you say, these visions of the apostles, there is a tremendous documentary evidence for these views of Christ, that the view of Christ as God, the view of the resurrection, began very early, and we have an abundance of documentary evidence from writings of apologists, from Christian apologists, from writings of lives of saints, from martyrologies, stories about the martyrs, which indicate that from a very early time, these bedrock things about Christ, which the church believes and has taught consistently over the years, that these things were believed very early and very widely.
And very firmly.
Yes.
And I would like to throw back into the court of these scholars. On what basis do you assume so readily and so easily that Christ's statements about himself in the Gospels, or St. Paul's earlier statements, because we all believe that basically the epistles of St. Paul were written prior to the date of the Gospels by a decade or so. But if you want to draw fine lines, you can do that. But the point is that any of these documents, that somehow all of these very clear statements of Christ's divinity, of them, and the manifestations of miracles and the rest of it, on what basis are you going to assume that these are all interpolated? And so quickly and so easily.
And this is the problem you have. You have a movement which starts in basically the backwaters of Palestine and spreads very quickly throughout a thoroughly paganized Roman society in which it's an outlaw religion. And then that religion eventually, despite tremendous social pressure against it, manages to convince and to convert the body politic of the Roman Empire. And how do you explain this? Solely on the basis of a hoax.
That said, let's return once again to Peter Jennings.
His mother was in the temple of Apollo. She fell asleep during the night. She was impregnated by Apollo in the form of a snake. And therefore, of course, the child who was born was divine, Augustus. And of course, millions of people would have said in the first century, clear, look what he's done. He's brought peace to the warring empire. He's got rid of the the civil wars. He's our man. Peacemaker, Son of God, these are all titles of Caesar Augustus. Lord, when the same story is told of Mary, concerning Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, it means, where do you find your God? Do you find God in pomp and power with Augustus, or do you find God in a Jewish child so poor he didn't even have a home to be born in? That's really what's at issue in that story.
Some scholars think that there's another issue, that Jesus was illegitimate, and the story was a cover-up.
The cover-up was, if Jesus had been illegitimate, there would have been some effort to make it appear that he was not illegitimate, once he became a heroic figure.
And how would you respond to that, Father Michael?
Well, this is the classic argument by analogy, that if they can find something analogous in the pagan culture, therefore that discredits the Christian witness. It's a classic argument, well, because there were stories in pagan society of virgin births, therefore this virgin birth is typical of all of these pagan stories, would be it Hercules or whomever, you know, these divine births. Now, the problem, of course, is that they have to deal with the actual Jewish traditions of a virgin birth, traditions largely rejected now by rabbinical Judaism, but present in the translation known as the 70 or the Septuagint, concerning Isaiah 1:14, and in fact, the whole plethora of biblical literature, what we would call extra-biblical literature, the Book of Enoch and a whole series of books which existed at the time which described who the Messiah was, and the whole ethos of that era, beginning in 200 BC and going up to shortly before the time of Christ, in which stories circulated concerning the Messiah, that he would be born of a virgin. And as I said, rabbinical Judaism, for reasons of its own, largely because it has rejected Christianity, no longer accepts this view of Judaism. But at the time of Christ, there were many different Judaisms. It wasn't one Judaism. There was the Judaism of the Pharisees, the Judaism of the Sadducees, the Judaism of the Zealots, the Judaism of the Essenes, which he talks about later on in the program. And Judaism was not one monolithic viewpoint, one monolithic faith. And that's, I think, one of the things to understand is simply because these stories exist in the Christian understanding and also in the pagan understanding doesn't mean that they don't have historical validity. In fact, this was one of the bedrock doctrines of the early church, that Christ was born of a virgin.